Hi, I'm Bob Schwartz. My current home base is the Harvard Project on Workforce, which is a cross-faculty initiative at Harvard that brings together both faculty and students from three professional schools, education, business, and public policy, who have a common interest in the broad education and skills agenda. My colleague for this conversation is a wonderful colleague, Issa Ellis, who is a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We've had a little bit of opportunity to work together, and we were both looking forward to this opportunity to actually catch up and have a more substantial conversation about a couple of topics of mutual interest. And we agreed I would start this off by saying a word about a current initiative just getting underway actually this week under the sponsorship of the Harvard Project on Workforce. We're just about 2 years old, and last summer, particularly in the COVID crisis, we decided to launch a summer fellowship program for last summer a dozen students, this summer 15. We put them in three-person work teams to work with public agencies on kind of workforce related topics that are of priority for those agencies. And as it happens, I'm working closely with a team that started this week on a project in which the client, or for which the client, is the City of Boston Mayor's Office, the acting mayor, Kim Janey, in particular. And as Issa knows, one of the pillars of the Pathways to Prosperity work that I've been involved in at JFF for the last decade or so has been to try to persuade states and regions that we work with that over time, one big goal ought to be to provide an opportunity for every young person to get started while in high school, on college, and also to have enough kind of work-based learning experience, ideally culminating in a paid internship, so that that young person has some sense of what his or her real interests are, how they match with the opportunities in the labor market, so they can get going on a kind of focused program in post-secondary education that plays to their interests. And ideally, they will already have started accumulating some college credits before they even start. So the request from the City of Boston is for our Summer Fellows team over the next 8 weeks to do a kind of feasibility study to figure out what would it actually take in a city like Boston to scale up these opportunities so that 3 years from now, they're essentially universal, that all kids would have such opportunities. An exciting challenge. I would not have agreed to devote our sort of summer fellowship resources to this project if I didn't know that in Boston, there happened to be two very strong, substantial, long-run intermediary organizations that I think are really essential for this kind of work, without which I can't imagine accomplishing these objectives. One of them is an intermediary that particularly focuses on school to work. It's employer-facing. It's called the Boston Private Industry Council. It's always been led by sort of leading employers, and it has a long track record, particularly of scaling summer work opportunities for young people in private sector firms and some of the large Boston area nonprofits, hospitals in particular. The other thing is that if you're going to actually help high school juniors and seniors be able to take advantage of these kinds of opportunities, you need to begin much earlier, and we would argue you need a kind of at least grades 6 through 10 strategy, and that strategy needs to combine in-school opportunities and, most important, out of school and after school opportunities for kind of youth development, but youth development in a kind of focused way that has college and career readiness at the center. And again, Boston has a terrific organization called Boston Beyond. That's a kind of umbrella organization for a lot of the after school work. So this leads me, Issa, to sort of turn to you and say, you've been leading this Equitable Pathways initiative focused on the work of intermediaries in a handful of places around the country. Some of my JFF colleagues have been one of your partners in this work, and I'm really curious to know kind of what you've learned from this work to date. What's it going to take to really create a kind of a more national network of intermediaries? How do we convince city leaders, especially around the country, that this work can't be done without really high quality intermediaries that are the interface between schools and workplaces that can bring together the right kinds of players that are needed to really do this work at scale. So over to you.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot, Bob. Well, it's always exciting to hear about a new project that's being that's at the startup phase, because we're learning so much about the work of intermediaries. As we learn, we're trying to get as much information out there as possible so that folks don't have to really just start from the ground up. They can really take the learnings of what's been done well, right? And leverage that to support what they're trying to do. So the work that I manage with my colleagues at the Gates Foundation is, so we have a pathway strategy, and as part of the pathways strategy, we're focused on like 4 big areas, right? So there's enabling conditions that need to be in place, like data infrastructure, policy, like narrative shift, right? There are really specific solutions, right, that need to be at play, that speak to specific interventions like advising, social capital development. That's where the guided pathways work fits, like credit mobility, right? There's also this knowledge management and mobilization play, right? Because there's so much knowledge that's out there and that's been curated, but where does it live, and who is it being curated for, and to do what with, right? But at the center of all of this, like, are these coordinating entities who help bring all these pieces together, and that's the work of intermediaries, right? And so you have these regional organizations that show up in many different ways. Some are employers, some are youth development agencies, some are civic organizations, some are nonprofits, some are state organizations. So they show up in very different ways, but at the heart, like, of what they do, it's really about, they're the organizations that are bringing the actors together in a local ecosystem to elevate a shared equity outcome or shared equity goal, right? So they know who are the young people that have been most and historically marginalized in a place. Why is that the case? Why does that continue to persist? And how do these entities, meaning K-12 post-secondary workforce, need to come together and show up differently, operate differently, take on different behaviors in service to these, a shared equity goal? So intermediaries, no matter who they are, at the heart, like, they are brokers, they are conveners, they are connectors in their ecosystem, right? And they're very well networked and influencers, right, in their local ecosystem. And so what we've learned over the last few years is that, one, they show up, there's a lot of different organizations and leaders who have taken on this role. We've also learned that there's some very specific attributes of these organizations, right? So beyond the connector, convener, and brokering of the relationships, there's some very specific things that they do, right? So partnerships is key to their work. So partnering with K-12, because that's oftentimes their pipeline partner, right? So partnering intentionally with K-12 and co-designing with K-12. Partnering with post-secondary institutions to provide credit-bearing courses, career-connected courses, dual enrollment courses, right? Partnering with employers, right? Making sure that employers are not, they don't have these transactional relationships where you train the students up and then you just pass them along to employers to then place them in jobs. But employers are co-designing, right, curriculum. They're providing professional skills development. They're providing work-based learning in the form of internships, apprenticeships, so on and so forth. And they're providing access to their staff, right? So that young people get access to professionals so they can build their social network, right? And build their social capital. So they do partnership work. They're very clear on the pathways that are in demand or emerging in their ecosystem. So they're very familiar with labor market data and making sure the pathways that they're preparing young people for are meaningful pathways that are for real jobs, right? And not just jobs that put them on a path to a living wage, but jobs that put them on a path to economic opportunity and mobility, right? So they can launch careers that lead to economic mobility. And these organizations are very much focused on policy. They know that in order to do this work, you have to understand policy and you have to play in the policy arena. So that's big P policy, understanding federal dollars and how those federal dollars trickle down and how they're deployed and how to braid and blend those dollars with state level dollars and labor money, with ed money. But it's also small P policy, right? It's also, each of these actors have policies in place within their institutions that often get in the way of the work, right? And so these organizations, intermediaries, often help to get ahead of understanding what those are and try to break barriers within those policies. So those are some of the things we've learned in terms of the work of intermediaries, like over the last 3 years, and the work that we're still learning.
You've really described a pretty tall order. There's
Yes.
lots of different roles, lots of different competencies. And I think, kind of building an understanding of why such organizations are absolutely critical if you're going to have a coherent regional structure to attack this problem. And I think particularly, as you frame it the way we do. This is ultimately about economic opportunity and mobility.
Yes.
And you can't achieve those goals without bringing together a variety of players, most critically, both the post-secondary institutions and the employers who are going to be the ones who ultimately have to provide that. One of the things, I know one of the themes of this Horizons conference is to help people think in a more connected way about work and learning. One of the things I think we've learned, you and I together in this work over the last several years, is that, at least when I started out, people talked about college and career as if these were two separate things, that some young people were going to be prepared for college and other for career. We now have, at least at the level of rhetoric, people have bought the idea that college and career readiness are two sides of one coin. And one of the things that interests me about this work that we're starting in Boston is, can we get higher ed institutions and employers to develop a more integrated strategy so that the kind of work experiences that young people are getting while they're in high school are aligned with the kind of dual enrollment, early college experiences they're getting, that's focused on particularly in broad occupational areas where we know there's going to be opportunities for growth and mobility. And then, more importantly, can we get employers and higher ed institutions to maintain those relationships with young people as they cross the border from high school to post-secondary? So that in particular, I think particularly for one reason that our community college dropout rates are so astronomically high is that virtually all urban kids who are going to community colleges are working at least 20 hours a week while they're going to school. And typically the work and the school commitments are in collision. If we could actually get them aligned so that the work was aligned with their academic program and the schedules were designed to mesh with one another, I think we could significantly reduce the dropout rate and get many more kids to completion of that first post-secondary credential, at least. And then they're on their way. Then they can do whatever they want to do next.
I agree.
So if we come back to the intermediary question, you have a very interesting mix of them. And I was just thinking, the three that I know best that are in your network are all very different from one another. You've got Here to Here in New York City, which is almost like an operating foundation. You've got, CareerWise Colorado, a new nonprofit that was stood up for a specific purpose to implement a very ambitious youth apprenticeship model that ultimately is designed to involve a lot of kids across the state. And then in your home state, you've got something that's it's not quite an intermediary. It's a kind of a unit kind of attached to the governor's office, but that is playing a really extraordinary coordinating role across this very ambitious and I think very thoughtful state strategy called Career Connect Washington, where among other things, it's at the state level, it's coordinating the work of a whole set of state agencies, education, workforce, economic development. But most interestingly, it also is supporting the work of two networks of regional intermediary organizations. One that is the classic kind of intermediary that you've been describing, the convener in the region that brings people together. The other is a more sort of what they call program intermediaries, which is the organizations that are standing up these, so-called career launch programs, apprenticeship and others that really do provide the opportunities for young people to get the kind of credentials that they should have, both on the academic and work side as they exit high school. So talk a bit about, the range of intermediaries you're working with and how you see, the value of their learning from one another.
It's that's so very interesting. So you're absolutely right. We do have a mix of organizations and some that are lean more on the program provider side and some that are truly showing up as coordinators in their ecosystem. I will say one thing that's been consistent across the board, whether they're like the CareerWise Colorado or the Here to Here's, when they enter this space and they enter the market, it's to solve a very specific problem. So usually when they take on a programmatic role, it's because either it's not happening in their ecosystem, or it's not happening at the level that it could potentially be happening. So they take that on, oftentimes with the intention that they won't continue that work in the long term, right? It provides them an opportunity to enter the market, to serve students, and to create a strong proof point of what the work can look like, right? And then to potentially scale more broadly, right? So I would say an example of that would be Youth Force Nola. So in New Orleans, there's an organization called Youth Force Nola, and they're a regional intermediary. And so when Youth Force Nola started about 5 or so years ago, they were doing not only so they've identified some very specific needs in a particular in their particular market for their particular students, because employers were consistently saying, like, students are graduating from the school district or the recovery school district, and why is it that we're unable to hire those students? Like, why is there a mismatch between the skills that they're leaving school with and the skills that we need, right? And so Youth Force Nola stepped in to not only make sure that students were being developed in the ways that they needed to, but also helping employers shift their mindsets, right? Around, it's not a youth problem, it's a system problem, and employers, you need to think differently about your talent, right? And if you're trying to be very intentional about diversifying your talent base and bringing on really smart and talented young people. And so when they initially started, they were not only doing like the work-based learning work, like providing the opportunities for internships for their young people, but they were also doing the training pieces themselves. And then over time, the leader at that organization, Kate Swinburne, realized, you know what, this is a competency that's needed in our ecosystem, but not necessarily a competency that we need to own, right? So they incubated a new organization. She and her steering committee, which is representative of different stakeholders across the region, decided to incubate a new entity called the New Orleans Career Center, right? And so now that organization is like the center for all training, for youth training. And I think that's what's interesting about intermediaries across the board, is that at the end of the day, they want to be the conveners, they want to be the connectors, they want to operate at the systems level and focus on systems change. But in order to enter their market, they usually enter from a programmatic perspective, right? Because they want to show in that market what's possible. And so Youth Force Nola is an example of one that's done that. I'll just very quickly say what's interesting about Career Connect Washington is that they did start endorsed by the governor of Washington. Most of their funding comes from the legislature. Very interesting, very different model, connecting all the players at the state level. And what they've done is they've set themselves up as a statewide intermediary that then funds 9 regional networks, right? And each regional network has an intermediary lead that does the work of what many of our intermediaries do across the country. So it's just interesting ways of how people decide to enter the market based on where the opportunity is. But at the end of the day, they want to be those conveners and brokers and focus on systems change.
Yeah, I think these are great examples. And I think, it's funny when you were talking about Youth Nola.
Yeah.
Here to Here had a similar strategy. It's incubated and then it's spun off, not wanting to lose its kind of intermediary function in a sense. Mm-hmm. And I think, one of the things I've admired about the small team in Washington State is they're a tiny, nimble team, and they're clear about what they do. And they have really, the Washington strategy is a very decentralized one, but it's guided by a common vision and a centralized funding structure. And these are really interesting, examples. So let's shift to a second topic where you and I have some shared interest and shared history. You and I first met in New York City, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, time flies, at a small meeting of funders who came together because they had a shared interest in career pathways / CTE, and we're just starting to talk about how they might work together. And I think you and I were both there to give, kind of a bit of an outsider's, presentation to them. I know that was my role. Fast forward, you're now a part of a more structured kind of consortium of funders I think of as being kind of on a learning journey. And my wife and I talked with you guys, I think, at one of your first kind of monthly seminars. And say a word about this, because I should say, the reason I have such an interest is I spent most of the 1990s leading the education grant making program at what for the time was a large national foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust. This was well before the Gates Foundation redefined what it meant to be a large national foundation. But, and then I subsequently in the 2000s, I was on the board of a smaller, but I thought highly focused and effective family foundation, the Noyce Foundation, based in both California and Massachusetts. And I've taught courses on foundations and their role in school reform, and I've run institutes for grant makers. So this has been a continuing interest of mine, and obviously you are now very much in that world. So talk a bit about both the kind of the work of this consortium and funders learning together, but then also the more challenging question of funders actually collaborating together, you know, and grant making, which it's one of those hopes we always hold out, but you know, sometimes hard, you know, easier to talk about, harder to do.
Yeah. So I will say this, philanthropy in this space, in a pathway space.
Yeah.
So there are a number of funders at the national level in this space, and many more, right, at the local level, but a number of funders at the national level. And we at the Gates Foundation, like, we're one of the youngest funders in this space. We've only been in this coordinated way in the last maybe 3 years or so. And so I would say what's really powerful about this community of funders is that what we do is that we come together very intentionally with a really clear learning agenda, with the intention of, let's build a general foundation for what we know across foundations, right? Because we all know pieces based on what we funded, curated, so on and so forth. Let's build a general baseline foundation for what we know, and then spend the time to learn from the field, hear from the field, and then figure out, like, what is our specific role as philanthropy, right? So we don't sit outside of the system, like, we are part of it, right? And unfortunately, some of the ways in which philanthropy has engaged in this work in the past has contributed to the barriers, has contributed to the inequities, right? And so, one, acknowledging the role that we play, acknowledging our own influence, and then being very intentional about, we want to get really clear on how we can add value to the field, all right, and be better partners to practitioners, policymakers, researchers, you name it, right, in this field. So that was the intention of us getting together, build our knowledge, build a common understanding of what's happening, and really get clear on how we as philanthropy and funders of this work can show up for the field. Where we are right now in this work is we've been coming together very intentionally. There's a lot of small focus groups, but this holistic group has been coming together for about 9 months or so now. So where we are in this journey is now, it's like, okay, what do we do with all the information we've learned, right? And what are some recommendations that we want to offer up? And what are some aligned principles for philanthropy? And so where we've seen that there's some real opportunity from a philanthropic perspective is, one, there's an opportunity for a shared learning agenda. Each organization, each philanthropy has its own learning agenda with learning questions. There's an opportunity for us to come together and align on some learning questions and work with the field and co-developing and designing those questions. And then as we're funding the research, making that research available, but being clear about the use case. It is not for philanthropy. It's not simply for policymakers, not simply for researchers, but it's also for practitioners in the field. So co-designing a shared research agenda. Another thing that we are trying to tackle together as philanthropy and see what recommendations we can put out is really around, like, what does systems change really mean? Like, we use that term a lot, we use it very loosely. What is it about the system and what is it about the actors that need to change, right? And offering up some real solutions around that. So that's something that we are trying to come together to offer up some real recommendations to the field around what we've heard and what we've been able to learn. The last thing I'll share, because there's so many more things that we've thought about and that we're thinking about, pretty much across the board, we believe we all are, like, beyond believers, like, we're invested in intermediaries. So we all believe there's this set of actors that we really need to help stand up in across the field, right? And so we're all investing in like a couple of organizations here, a couple of organizations there. And so a number of us are getting together to co-fund a community of practice led by JSF of intermediaries to collectively understand the function, understand the attributes, help these intermediaries become stronger proof points in their regions, but also to proactively share the learning so we can mobilize the field to start valuing the work of intermediaries across the country. So those are some of the things that we're anchored on. To your question around co-investment and what does that really look like, I will say, we are co-investing in some of these projects. How to simplify co-investment for our partners is what we still need to figure out, right? So when you get to tactically what that means, that's what we're trying to, how do you simplify the paperwork?
This is always the challenge,
That is always, yeah. So we're trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I think with the best interest in the world, often these collaborations wind up torturing their grantees.
Yes.
By requiring them to file separate reports and everything. If funders could agree, we will accept, a common set of reports on a common timeline. That would help. I will share.
I was just quickly share. I will say with this project that we're doing with Jobs for the Future and this new community, like this new phase of the community of practice, my other funder partners and I are aligned on a goal. So minimally, we've aligned on goals, we've aligned on timeline, we've aligned on objectives. And so now we just need to get past the paperwork.
Yeah, I think this is very exciting. And I think the fact that you guys have taken the time to actually meet together, learn from one another, get exposed to some common things. I don't know whether you were a participant, but I know some members of that group participated in this summer institute that called Semets, that an old friend of ours who for years headed up the federal office that oversees the Swiss vocational system, that she runs out of it's really the Swiss version of MIT. If you can imagine MIT in the United States taking career and technical education seriously enough to create a research unit on it, headed by a practitioner, that's the Swiss example. And I know that the youth apprenticeship has been one of the topics that's been kind of, of interest to a lot of the funders. So I think this is a really exciting development for the field. We're obviously entering a period, still hard to know how much of Biden's very ambitious agenda is going to get done. But it does seem to me it's pretty clear there's going to be, a lot more emphasis in this administration on work and on workers and on skills and skill development and on opportunity and mobility. So I think the opportunity for both public and private funders to collaborate in different ways and to do it with the field, I think there's some important potential, outcomes here as we move toward what I think has to be a kind of shared conception of what a coordinated work and learning strategy is going to look like, not just in school, but beyond school. Because, we're moving into a world in which work and learning are not going to stop. There's not a terminal point here. This is going to be a condition, I think, of successfully being able to thrive in this very rapidly changing and evolving economy. And getting people started in getting schools in particular to understand this conception of work and learning as two sides of the same coin that need to be coordinated. That to me is the big name of the game. Unless you've got any final words of observation, it's been really great to have a chance to reconnect and have this conversation. And you and I agreed beforehand, we will continue this. We will not make this.
Yes, I look forward to it.
The same. So I think with that, thank you so much, Isa Ellis. And
thank you, Bob.
Back to the larger horizons conversation.